Good afternoon. My name is Diane Hurd, and I will be your hostess or mistress of ceremony for this afternoon's program. I would like to start off by telling you a little story. In 2016, we presented our first slave narratives to our community here in Carroll County, Maryland. One of the stories was regarding a gentleman named Manilis Gasaway. Here's a little bit of his story. Personal interview with Manilis Gasaway, ex-slave, on September 22nd, 1937, at M.E. Home, Carrolltown Avenue, Baltimore, Maryland. My name is Manilis Gasaway, son of Owen and Annabelle Gasaway. I was born in Freedom District, Carroll County, about 1850 or 52. Brother of Henrietta, Manila, and Bella. Our father and mother moved in Carroll County near Eldersburg in a stone and log cabin consisting of 2 rooms, one up, one down, with 4 windows, 2 in each room, on a small farm situated on a public road. I don't know the name. After the end of the program, someone came up to me and said, I'm related to the Gasaways. I was excited to hear this story. The following year, I met descendants of Gasaway, and then a year later, I met another descendant of Manilis Gasaway. I was happy to share his story, this story they had never heard before. So today, you're going to hear stories from your ancestors, stories that you may never heard before. I encourage you to listen hard to the person's name as well as where the interview took place. These are all from North Carolina. You'll be surprised at what you might hear. With that, the first thing I'd like to do is bring forth Master Matthew Fitchett, so that he can present to you our welcome announcement. Thank you.
Our history in the United States began in 1619. We were enslaved. We made fortunes for others. We cared for children that were not ours. We suffered. We fought in wars like World War I and II and Vietnam. We stood tall like Harriet Tubman, Dr. King, and Malcolm X. We stood out like Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, and Thurgood Marshall. In 1926, we were allowed a week to celebrate Black excellence. In 1976, we were allowed a month to celebrate Black excellence. Today we say our lives matter more than 1 month. We say Black Lives Matter. We say Black History Matters. Welcome to 2021 and our Black History program. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'd like to welcome Elder Reba Fitchett to the stage to offer us a prayer.
Our gracious Master, we come, Lord, to thank you for this day. We thank you, Lord, for just being good to us. We thank you for your mercifulness. And then, Lord, now as we gather to participate and to reflect on the past of our families, our friends, and of the Black community, as we reflect on the words and the emotional feelings that they have given in interviews. And so now, Lord, we're asking that as we stand tall on their shoulders, we're standing on the promises of God. And in the present, we are leaning on the everlasting arms of Jesus. And then in the future, we can't wait until we see Jesus. So, Lord, now bless our director, bless our producer, and bless all the participants of this Black History program. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. I like to start with a poem. It's called Bury Me in a Free Land by Frances Ellen Watkins Hopper. Make me a grave wherever you will, in a lonely plain or a lofty hill. Make it among earth's humblest graves, but do not bury me where men were slaves. I could not rest if around my grave I heard the steps of a trembling slave. His shadow above my silent tomb would make it a place of fearful gloom. I could not rest if I heard the thread of a coffin gang to the shambles led, and the mother's shriek of wild despair rise like a corse in the trembling air. I could not sleep if I saw the lash drinking her blood at each fearful gash, and I saw her babes torn from her breasts like trembling doves from their parents' nest. I shudder and start if I heard the bay of bloodhounds seizing their human prey, and if I and I heard the captives plead in vain as they bound afresh his gagging chain. If I saw young girls from their mother's arm bartered and sold for their useful charm, my eyes would flash with a mournful flame, my death pale cheek grow red with shame. I would sleep, dear friend, where bolted might can rob no man of his dearest right. My rest shall be calm in any grave where none can call his brother a slave. I ask no monument, proud and high, to arrest the gaze of a passerby. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves. I would now like to introduce you to the slave narratives. These are called the slave narratives administrative files. They are the work of the Project Gutenberg. This collection of narratives had its beginnings in the second year of the Writers' Federal Project, now known as the Writers' Program, in 1936, When several state writers' projects, notably those of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, recorded interviews with ex slaves residing in those states. To get the Negro interested in talking about days of slavery in 1937, a standard questionnaire for field workers was developed. But if the Negroes was willing to talk freely, he was encouraged to say what he pleased without reference to the questions. The Federal Writers Project was not interested in taking sides on the questions. The workers were not to censor any material collected, regardless of the nature. Any indication of facts that could be recalled were written down as nearly as possible, just as said by them, but not to use dialect spelling so complicated that it may confuse the reader. It was recommended that the stories be told in the language of the enslaved without excessive editorializing or artistic instructions on their part of the interviewer. Words like darky and nigger and such expressions as comical little old black woman should be omitted from the editorial. However, where the slave himself uses these words, they should be retained. On file in 1939 was a large body of slave narratives, photographs of former slaves, interviews with white informants regarding slavery, transcripts of laws, advertisements, records of sales, transfers, and manumission of slaves and other documents. As unpublished manuscripts of the Federal Writers Project, these records passed into the hands of the Library of Congress for processing, and from them has been assembled the present collection of some 2,000 narratives from 17 states, including North Carolina. For the first and last time, a large number of surviving slaves were permitted to tell their story in their own way. This saga must remain the most authentic and colorful source of our knowledge of the lives and thoughts of thousands of slaves, of their attitude towards one another, towards their masters, mistresses, and their overseers, toward poor whites, North, South, and the Civil War, emancipation, Reconstruction, religion, education, and virtually every phase of Negro life in the South. We present to you, ladies and gentlemen, we present to you today the Slaves Narratives, Administrative Files for North Carolina.
Fanny Griffin. No, ma'am, we ain't had no celebration after we was freed. We ain't know we was free till a good while after. We ain't know it till General Willard came through and tell us. After that, the massa and the missus let us all the slaves go, except me. They kept me to work in the house and the garden.
Our first narrative is that of Emma Blaylock, an 88-year-old located at 529 Brandon Avenue, Raleigh, North Carolina.
I sure do remember the Yankees with their blue uniforms, with brass buttons on them. I was too small to work any, but I played in the yard with my older sister, Katie. She's dead long ago. My mother belonged to old man John Griffith, and I belonged to him. His plantation was down here at Auburn in Wake County. My father was named Edmund Rand. He belonged to Mr. Nat Rand. He lived in Auburn. The plantations was not far apart. There was about 25 slaves on the plantation where my mother and me stayed. Master John used to take me on his knee and sing, "Here is the hammer, shing ding, give me the hammer, shing ding." Yeah, Master loved the nigger chillings on his plantation. When the war ended, Father come and lived with us at Master John's plantation. Master John Griffith named me Emmy. My grandfather on my father's side was named Hardin Rand, and grandmother named Mason Rand. My grandfather on my mother's side was named Anthony Griffith, and grandmother was named Nellie. Our food was aplenty and well cooked. Master fed his niggas good. We had plenty of homespun dresses, and we got shoes once a year at Christmas Eve. I can't remember, it's just as good. We got Christmas holidays and a stocking full of candy and peanuts. Sometimes we got ginger snaps at Christmas. My grandmother cooked them. She was a good cook. My mother's missus was Miss Jetsy Griffith. And my father's missus was Lucy Rand. They was both mighty good women. You know, I am old. I can remember all them good old white folks. They give us 4th of July holidays. They come to town on that day. They wore, let me tell you what they wore. They wore dotted waist blouses and white pants. That was a big day to everybody. The 4th of July. The day begun singing at Albans. They sung till they reached Raleigh. Auburn is 9 miles from Raleigh. There was a lot of lemonade. They made light bread in big ovens and had cheese to eat with it. Some say they're going on the 4th just to get lemonade and cheese. In the winter, we had a lot of possums to eat and a lot of rabbits too. At Christmas time, the men hunted and caught plenty of game. We barbecued it before the fire. I remember seeing mother and grandmother swinging rabbits for the fire to cook them. They would turn them till they was done. They hung them up in the chimney and dry them out and keep them a long time. And that is the reason I won't eat a rabbit today. No, sir. I won't eat a rabbit. I seen them mess with them. So much turned me against eating them. I don't know how much land Master John owned, but honey, that was some plantation. It reached from Auburn to the Neuse River. Yes, sir, it did. Because I've been down there cornhilling time, and we fished at 12 o'clock in the Neuse River. Master John had overseers. There was about 6 of them. They rode horses over the fields, but I don't remember the names. I never seen a slave whooped, but they was whooped on the plantation. And I heard the grown folks talking about it. My uncles Nat and Bert Griffiths was both whooped. Uncle Nat wouldn't obey his missus' rules, and she had him whooped. They whooped Uncle Bert because he stayed drunk so much. He loved his liquor, and he got drunk and cut up bad. Then they whooped him. He could get plenty whiskey then. 'Twon't like it is now, no. No, sir, it won't. Whiskey sold for about 10 cents a quart. Most everybody drank it, but you hardly ever see a man drunk. Slaves wasn't whooped for drinking. Their masters give them whiskey, but they was whooped for getting drunk. There was a jail, a kind of stockade built of logs on the farm to put slaves in when they wouldn't mind. I never say any slave put on the block and sold, but I saw Aunt Helen Rand crying because her master Nat Rand sold her boy Fab Rand. No, sir, no reading and writing. You had to work. you let your master or your missus catch you with a book, ooh, that was a strict rule that no learning was to be taught. I can't read and write. If it was not for my mother, would don't know what would become of me. We had prayer meetings around the slave houses. I remember it well. We turned down the pots on the inside of the house at the door just to keep our master and missus from hearing the singing and the praying. Master and his family, they lived in a great house, and the slave quarters was about 200 miles away to the back of the great house. They was ranged in rows. When the war ended, that is all except my father and me. He left and I left. I've been in Raleigh 45 years. I married Mac Blaylock in Raleigh. He been dead 7 years. My mother had 2 boys, Anthony and Wesley, and she had 4 girls, Katie, Grissy, Mariella, and Emma. I had 3 children. 2 are living yet. They both live in Raleigh. We had big suppers and dinners at log rollings and corn shuckings in slavery time. Plenty of corn liquor for everybody, both white and black. Everybody helped himself. Dr. Tom Busby, one good old white man, he looked after us when we got sick. And he could make you well pretty quick because he was good and because he was sorry for you. He was a feeling man. Of course, we took herbs. I tell you what I took. Yeah. Scurry grass and China balls. They was for worms. Scurry grass worked you out. They give us wintergreen to cleanse our blood. And we slaves and a lot of the white folks drank sassafras tea in the place of coffee. We sweeten it with brown sugar and honey or molasses, just what we had in that line. I think slavery was a good right thing, plenty to eat and wear. When you get a tooth pulled now, it costs $2, don't it? Well, in slavery time, I had a tooth bothering me. My mother said, Emma, take this egg and go to Dr. Busby and give that egg to him and get your tooth pulled. I give him 1 egg. He took it and he pulled my tooth. Try that now. If he wants to and see what happens. Yes, slavery was a pretty good thing.
The next narrative, Days on the Plantation, as told by Uncle David Blunt, formerly of Beaufort County, who did not know his age. The master he refers to was Major William A. Blunt, who owned plantations in several parts of North Carolina.
Yes, the days on the plantation were the happy days. The master made us work, but during the week, but on Saturdays, we used to go swimming in the river. Oh, and do a lot of other things we like to do too. We didn't mind the work so much because the ground was soft as ashes, and the master let us stop and rest when we got tired. We planted taters in the uplands and corn on the lower ground next to the river. It was near Cape Fear. On hot days, when we were pulling up the fodder, we all would stop work around 3 o'clock in the evening and go swimming. After we come out of the water, we work harder than ever before. The master was good to us because we did work and we done what he asked us. We done what he asked us. I remember once the master had an overseer dog that was meaner than a mean nigga. He always hired good overseers, and a whole lot of times he let some Negro slave oversee. Well, this overseer beat some of the half-grown boys till the blood run down to their heels, and told the rest of us that if we told on him that he'd kill us. We don't dare and ask the master to get rid of the man, so this went on for a long time, too long. It was cold as the devil one day, and this overseer had a gang of us clearing new ground. One young boy asked if he could warm himself by the brush heap. The overseer said no. After a while, the boy got a chill. The overseer don't care. That night, the boy am a sick nigga. The next morning, the master gets the doctor, and the doctor says that he's got pneumonia. He tells him to take off the boy's shirt and grease him with tar, and they had some turpentine and kerosene. And when they start to take the shirt off, they finds out that it am stuck. They had to grease the shirt to get it off because the blood where the overseer beat him had stuck the shirt tight to the skin. The master was in the room and he asked the boy, how come it? And the boy told him. The master turns white and he says to me, will you go after overseer to come hire a minute, please? When the overseer comes up the steps, he acts as sassy like, what y'all want? The master says, pack your things and get it off of my property as fast as you can, you pesky varmint. The overseer sasses the master some more. And then I sees the master fairly lose his temper for the first time. He don't say a word. But he walks over, grabs the overseer by the shoulders, sets his boot right hard against his pants, and sends him all drawed out in the yard on his face. He closed up like an umbrella for a minute, and he pulls himself together, and he limps out of that yard, and we ain't never seen him no more. No, ma'am. There was no marrying on the plantation in them days. An old woman raised all the children, and my brother Johnny, we never knew who our folks was. Johnny was a little fella when the war ended. But I was involved in most of the stuff on the plantation for a while. One time, I forget the year, some white men's come up the river on a boat, and they says into the fields and tells a gang of us that they says that our masters ain't treating us right. They says that we ought to be paid for our work, and that we hadn't ought to have passes to go anywhere. They tells us too that we ought to be allowed to tote guns if we want them. They says too that sometime our masters going to tell us and kill us all. I laughs at them. But some of them fool niggas listen to them. And it appears that these men give the niggas some guns when after I left and promised to bring some more the next week. I finds out the next day about this, and I go tells the master. He sort of laughs at me, scratches his head. Them niggas heading for trouble, Dave. He tells me, and I want y'all to go help me. I want you to help me. He says, yes, sir, master. I say, yes, sir, master. And he says, go now. I want you to find out when the rest of the guns coming, Dave, and let me know. When the men's come back with the guns, I tells the master. And I tells them that they want to hold a meeting. All right, he says, laughs. All right, they can have the meeting. You'll tell them, Dave, that I said that they can have a meeting on Tuesday night in the pack house. Tuesday night, He tells them, he sends them all down to the low ground but me. And he tells me to go up to the pack house and nail them shutters and nail them up good. Just like he tells me. Oh, yes, I did. And that night, the niggas march in and snuck them guns in too. I was lying up in the loft, and I hears them tell that after the meeting, they is going up to the big house and kill the whole family. I gets out the window, and I runs down the house, and I tells the master. Then me and him and the young master will go out quick as lightning. I slams the door, locks it. Then the master yells at him. I's got men and guns high. He yells at him, and if y'all don't throw them guns out the hole in the loft and throw them out, every one of them, I'm going to stick 5 to this pack house. The diggers liberates for a few minutes, and then they start throwing the guns out. Now I knows how many they got, so I counts them till they throw them all out. Then I gathers them up, and I totes them up to the big house. Well, sir, we keep them niggas shut up in there for a week on rations, short rations, and at the end of that time, them niggas them cured for good. When they come out, they had 3 overseers for instead of 1, and the rules am stricter than ever before. And then the master, the master goes off to war. I reckon I was about 15, 16 then. And the master calls me out with him, his personal servant and bodyguard, and leaves the rest of them niggas in the fields working hard, working like the Dickens. And I laughed at them Yankees. Now, Jim belongs to Mr. Harley, who lived in New Hanover County during the war. And in fact, he was young Master Harley's slave. So when young Master Tom went to the war, Jim went along too. They was at Manassas when they tell me that Master Tom was killed, and the orders was not to take nobodies off the field right then. Of course, Master down near Wilmington don't know about young Tom, Master Tom. But one night they hears Jim holler at the gate. He comes running out, and Jim has brung Master Tom's body all that long way home, said that he could be buried in the family burying ground. The master frees Jim that night, and he stays on for a while after the war. And till that day he died, he never forgave them Yankees for killing Master Tom. In fact, we all hated them Yankees, especially after we barely starved through the first winter. I tried to make a living for me and Johnny, but it was bad going. Then I hears that Raleigh was high. I went down Raleigh's, and I guess along a little better. After I get settled, bring Johnny. We done pretty good. We done pretty good after a while. That's all I can tell you now, Miss. If you come down later, I'll tell you the rest of them tales. Shortly after the above interview, Uncle Dave, who was failing fast, was taken to the county home where he died. He was buried May 14th, 1937, and the rest of the tale remains untold.
We'll now hear a voice of freedom.
Daniel Waring. Yes, sir. I was about 14 years old when President Lincoln set us all free in 1863. The war was still going on. And I'm telling you, right when I saw my folks and friends around me did not regard freedom as an unmixed blessing, we didn't know where to go or what to do. And so we stayed right where we was. And there wasn't much difference to our living, 'cause we had always had a plenty to eat and wear. I remember my mammy telling me that food was getting scarce, and any black folk begging to scratch for themselves would suffer. If they take their foot in their hand and ramble about that land like a wolf.
This next interview is with Andrew Boone, age 90, Wake Forest, North Carolina, Harris Farm.
I've been living I've been living in these back of barns 15 years. I built this little shelter to cook under. They cut me off, the WPA, because they said I was too old to work. They told us, old folks, we need to put down our walking sticks to get work. They just won't go in to put us on. Well, I had some tomatoes cooked without any grease for my breakfast. I had a loaf of bread yesterday, but I ate it. I ain't got any check from the old age pension, and I have nothing to eat, and I am hungry. I just looks to God. I sat down by the road thinking about how to turn and what to do to get a meal when you come along. I thanks I thanks you for this dime. I guess God made you give it to me. I was glad to take you down to my living place to give you my story. This shelter, an old tobacco barn, is better than no home at all. I is a man to myself, and I enjoy living out here if I could get enough to eat. Well, the big show is coming to town. It's the devil's work. Yes, sir. It's the devil's work. Why, them show folks can make snakes and make them crawl too. There was one in Watson Field in the edge of Raleigh not long ago, and he made snakes and made them crawl too. All shows is the devil's work. I never had anything for myself in all my life. I always worked for the rebels. I stuck right to them. Didn't have no sense for doing that, I guess. One time a rebel saw a Yankee with one eye, one leg, one arm. The Yankee was begging. The rebel went up to him and gave him a quarter. Then he backed off and just stood looking at the Yankee. Presently, he went back and gave him another quarter, then another quarter. Then he said, "You take this whole dollar. You is the first Yankee I ever see trimmed up just to my notion. So take all this. Take the whole dollar. You was just trimmed up to my notion." I belonged to Billy Boone in slavery time. He was a preacher. He lived on an old plantation in Northampton County. The plantation was near Woodland. The nearest river to the place was the Roanoke. My old missus' name was Nancy. When old master died, I stayed around with first one, then another of the chillins, because master told me just before he died for me to stay with any of them I wanted to stay with. All them old people dead and gone on. Niggas had to go through thick and thin in slavery time with rough rations, most of them time with just enough clothing to take out with. Our houses were built of logs and covered with slabs. They was rived out of blocks of trees about 3 to 6 and 8 feet long. The chimneys was built of sticks and mud, then a coat of clay mud daubed over them. Them cracks in the slave houses was daubed with mud too. We worked from sun to sun. If we had a fire in cold weather where we was working, master and the overseer would come out and put it out. We had frozen meat and bread many times in cold weather. After the day's work in the fields was over, we had a task of picking the seed from cotton till we had 2 ounces of lint, or spin 2 ounces of cotton on a spinning wheel. I spun cotton on a spinning wheel. That's the way people got clothes in slavery time. I can't read and write, but they learned us to count. They learned us to count this way. All is an all. A figure is a figure. All for the white man and nothing for the nigger. Hain't you heard people count that way? They sold slaves just like people sold horses now. I saw a lot of slaves sold on the auction block. They would strip them stark naked. A nigger scarred up or welled and welted up was considered a bad nigger and did nothing, not bring much. If his body was not scarred, he bought a good price. I saw a lot of slaves whooped, and I was whooped myself. They whipped me with the cat o' nine tails. It had 9 lashes on it. Some of the slaves was whooped with a cabin paddle. They had 40 holes in them. And when you was buckled to a barrel, they hit your naked flesh with the paddle. And everywhere there was a hole in the paddle, it drawed a blister. When the whipping with the paddle was over, they took the cat o' nine tails and busted the blisters. By this time, the blood sometimes would be running down their heels. Then the next thing was a wash in salt water strong enough to hold up an egg. Slaves was punished that way for running away and such. If you was out without a pass, they would sure get you. The patrollers sure looked after you. They would come to the house at night to see who was there. If you was out of place, they would wear you out. Sam Joyner, a slave, belonged to Master. He was running from the patrollers as he fell in an old well. The patroller went after Master. Master told him to get old Sam out and whoop him just as much as they wanted to. They got to him and got him out of the well, and he was all wet and muddy. Sam began taking off his shoes. Then he took off his pants and got his shirt tail. Master, he say, what you taking off your clothes for, Sam? Sam, he say, Master, you know y'all can't whip this nigga right over all these wet clothes. Then Sam lit out. He run so fast he nearly flew. The patrollers got on their horses and ran him, but they could not catch him. He got away. Master got Sam's clothes on and carried him to the house. Sam slipped up. Next morning, put his clothes on, and Master said no more about it. I was a great big boy when the Yankees come through. I was driving a 2-mule team and doing other work on the farm. I drove a 2-horse wagon when they carried slaves to market. I went to a lot of different places. My master was a preacher, Billy Boone. He sold and bought niggas. He had 50 or more. He worked the grown niggas in 2 squads. My father was named Isham Boone, and my mother was Sarah Boone. Master Boone whooped with the cabin paddle and the cat o' nine tails and used a salt bath, and that was enough. Plenty besides him whooped that way. Master had 1 son named Solomon and 2 girls, Elsie and Alice. My mother had 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl. The boys were named Sam, Walter, Andrew, that's me, and the girl was Cherry. My father had several children because he had several women besides mother, Molly and Leela Lassiter. 2 sisters were also his women. These women was given to him, and no other man was allowed to have anything to do with them. Molly and Leela both had chillins by him. Their names was Jim, Molly, Liza, Rosa, Pete, and I can't remember no more of them. The Yankees took just what they wanted, and nothing stopped them because the surrender had come. Before surrender, the slave owners began to scatter the slaves about from place to place to keep the Yankees from getting them. If the Yankees took a place and the slaves nearby was moved to a place further off. All I done was for the rebels. I was with them and I just done what I was told. I was afraid of the Yankees because the rebels had told us that the Yankees would kill us. They told us that the Yankees would bore holes in our shoulders and work us to carts. They told us we would be treated a lot worse than they was treating us. Well, the Yankees got here, but they treated us fine. Then the story went around that the master would have to give the slaves a mule and a year's provisions and some land, about 40 acres, but that was not so. They never did give us anything. When the war ended and was told we was free, we stayed with master because we had nothing and nowhere to go. We moved about from farm to farm. Mother died and father married Maria Edwards after the surrender. He did not live with any of his other slave wives that I knows of. I have worked as a hand on the farm most of the time since the surrender, and Daddy worked most of the time as a hand, but he had gardens and patches most everywhere he worked. I worked in New York City for 15 years with Crawford and Banhay in the show business. I advertised for him. I dressed in a white suit, white shirt, and white straw hat and wore tan shoes. I had to be a purdy boy. I had to have my shoes shine twice a day. I lived at 18 Manila Lane, New York City. It is between McDougal Street and 6th Avenue. I married Clara Taylor in New York City. We had two children. The oldest one lives in New York. The other died and is buried in Raleigh. In slavery time, they kept you down and you had to work. Now I can't work and I'm still down. Not allowed to work and still down. It's all hard, slavery and freedom. Both bad when you can't eat. The old bees make the honeycomb. The young bees makes the honey. Niggers make the cotton and corn, and the white folks get the money. This was the case in slavery time, and it's the case now. The nigger do most the hard work on the farms now, and the white folks still get the money that the niggers' labor makes.
This is a slave narrative of Adeline Crump, located at 526 Cannon Street.
My name is Adeline Crump, and I am 73 years old. My husband's name was James Crump. My mother's was Marie Cotton, and my father's name was Cotton. My mother belonged to the Fawcett's. Rich Fawcett was her master. Father belonged to the Cottons. Bright Cotton was his master. My maiden name was Cotton. Mother and father said they was treated all right, and they loved their white folks. They gave them patches, clothed them tolerably well, and see that they got plenty to eat. The hours of work was long. Near about everybody worked long hours then. But they said they was not mistreated about nothing. When they got sick, master got a doctor. If they was bad off sick. They was loud holidays, Christmas, and at lay-by time, and they was allowed to hunt possums and coons at night and catching rabbits and guns. They also caught birds in traps made of splinters split from pine wood. Mother and Fauna had no learning. They was not allowed to learn to read and write. Master was careful about that. I cannot read and write. My mother and father told me many stories about the Patty Rollers and Ku Klux Klan. A nigger better have a pass when he went visiting, or if they caught him, they tore up his back. The Ku Klux Klan made the niggers think they could drink a well full of water. They carried rubber things under their clothes and a rubber pipe leading to a bucket of water. The water bag held the water. They did not drink it. Guess you had heard people tell about they drinking so much water. Master didn't have no overseers to look after his slaves. He'd done that himself with the help of some of his men slaves. Sometimes he made them foremen, and my mother and father said they got along mighty fine. The colored folks went to the white folks' church and had prayer meetings in their homes. Mother lived on the edge of old Master's yard. When the surrender come after the war, they stayed on the plantation right there and lived on Master's lands. They built log houses after the war because Master let all of his slaves stay right on his plantation. My mother had 21 children. She had twins 5 times. I was a twin, and Emmeline was my sister. She died about 13 years ago. She left 11 children when she died. I never had but 4 children. All my people's dead. I was the only one left. Master's plantation was about 6 miles from Marioke in Chatham County. We moved to Marioke when I was 14 years old. I was married at 17. I lived in North Carolina all my life. We moved to Raleigh from Marioke a long time ago. My husband died here 17 years ago. I worked after my husband died, washing and ironing for white folks till I'm not able to work no more. Ain't worked in 4 years. Charity don't help me none. My children gives me what I gets. Slavery was a bad thing, 'cause from what my mother and father told me, all the slaves didn't fare alike. Some of them fared good and some bad. I don't know enough about Abraham Lincoln and Mr. Roosevelt to talk about 'em. No, I don't know what to say. I sure hopes you will quit asking me so many things, 'cause I forgot a lot about what mother and father told me.
This is a narrative about Mandy Coverson, an ex-slave. Mandy Coverson, 78 years old, of 103 South Wilmington Street, Raleigh, North Carolina.
I was born in Union County to Sarah and Henderson Tumberland. My mother belonged to Mr. Moses Coverson, and my pappy belonged to Mr. Jackie Tom Tumberland. I stayed with my mammy, of course, and Master Moses was good to me. They wasn't so good to my mammy, case they makes her work from sunup till sundown in the hot summertime. And she ain't had no fun at all. She plowed 2 oxes. And if and yo has ever been around a steer, yo knows what aggravating things they is. The observer, whose name I plumb forgot, was Pone White Trash, and he was meaner than the meanest nigger. Anyhow, I was too little to do much work, so I played a heap and I had a big time. My mammy died before I was very old, and Mrs. kept me in the house. I was petted by her, and I reckon I was spoiled. You know that them there niggers ain't never eat no biscuits, but Mrs. always give me one every meal, and in that way she got me interested in waiting on the table. I wasn't old enough to know much, but I does remember how he family hid all the valuables for the Yankees come, and that Master Moses in picking up the big brass andirums hurt his back, and they said that was because of his death a little while afterwards. Anyhow, these andirums were saved, and they were no trouble with the Yankees who come our way. And they ain't hurting nobody, duh. They did kill all these things that they could eat, and they stole the rest, the feed stuff. They make one nigger boy draw water for their horses for a day and night. The Yankees was mean about cussing, but these Southern soldiers was just as bad. Wheeler's cavalry was the meanest in the whole bunch, I think. The Ku Klux Klansies was pretty mean, but they picked their spite on the free issues. I don't know why they done this, except that they ain't wanting no niggers of favoring them now bite. And not that slavery am over. They done a heap of beating and chasing folks out in the country. But I expect that the carpetbaggers rule was mostly the cause of it. I married Daniel Coverson, a slave on the same plantation I was on. 40 years ago, we moved to Raleigh. We had a hard time, but I'm glad that he and me am free and done belong to two different families.
Sarah Jane Patterson. I was living in Bartow County in North Georgia where freedom came. I don't remember how the slaves found it out. I remember them saying, "Well, they're all free." And that is all I remember. And I remember someone saying, asking a question, "You gotta say master." And somebody answered and said, "Nah," but they said it all the same. They said it for a long time, but they learned better though.
This is an interview on May 20th, 1937, with Charlie Berber, age 86, of Smithfield, North Carolina, Johnston County.
I belonged to Mr. Bob Lumsford here in Smithfield from the time of my birth. My mammy was named Candace and my pappy's name was Seth. My brothers was Rufus, William, and George, and my sisters was Mary and Laura. I'm reminded of the days when as a youngin' I played marbles and hide and seek. There weren't many games then because nobody ain't had time for 'em. Grown folkses had dances and sometimes corn shuckings, and the little niggers patted their feet at the dances, and they helped shuck the corn. At Christmas, we had a big dinner, and from then through New Year's Day, we feast and we dance and we sang. The first one who who said Christmas gift to anybody else got a gift. So of course we all tried to catch the monster. On the night before the first day of January, we had a dance that lasts all night. At midnight, when the new year comes in, Master makes a speech, and we is happy that he thanks us for our year's work and says that we is good, smart slaves. Master worked his niggas from daylight till dark, and his 13 grown slaves had to tend about 300 acres of land. Of course, they mostly planted coffee, peas, and vegetables. I can remember, though I was small, that the slaves was whooped for disobeying. And I can think of several that I got. I was doing housework at the time, and one of the silver knives got misplaced. They accused me of misplacing it on purpose. So I got the worst beating that I ever had. I was beat till the hide was busted here and there. One of the we little ones sometimes like to go swimming, and we did. We also fished, and at night we hunted the possums and coons sometimes. Old Uncle James had some hounds would run on possums and coons, and he would take us boys along with him. I remember once the hound struck a trail and they treed the coon. Uncle James sends Joe, who was bigger than I was, up the tree to catch the coon, and he warns him that the coon's them fighting fellas. Joe didn't pay much mind. He am so happy to get the chance to catch the coon, but when he catch that coon, he couldn't turn loose. And from the way he hollered, you would suppose that he ain't never wanted to catch a coon. When Joe Barber was buried here last winter, them coon marks was still strong on his arm and hands. There was a long scar on his face. I remember once a Yankee woman from New York looks at him and near about faints. I reckon, she say, what cruel slave owner or driver done to him? Yes, ma'am. I knows the Yankees come to Smithfield. They come with the beating of drums and waving of flags. They says that our governor was here making a speech, but he flew before they got here. Anyhow, we lived off the main path of march, and so we ain't been in trouble so much except the scooting parties and as my old missus call them. Them the darndest you ever seen. They won't eat no hog meat except hams and shoulders. They goes to the smokehouse and gets them without no permission. They has what they calls ramming rods to their guns, and they knock them chickens in the head with that. Heard them say they weren't no use no wasting powder on them chickens. They went over the neighborhood stealing and killing stock. I heard about them catching a pig, cutting off his hams, and leaving him there alive. The found all the things we had done hid, not that I thinks that they are witches, but that they was a money rod. It said that some of the slaves told them where master hid the things. Yes'm, I reckon I was glad to get free, because I knows that I won't wake up some morning to find my mammy or some of the rest of my family hadn't been sold. I left the day I heard about the surrender. And far right good too, though I knows them what ain't faring so well. I ain't never learned to read and write. I knows that I never will. I can't even write a letter to Raleigh about my old man's pension. And remembers the days when my mammy wore a blue handkerchief round her hand and cooked in the great house. She sometimes sneaked me a cookie or a cobbler and fruits. She had her own little garden and a few chickens, and we'd be so happy except that we was scared of being sold. I is glad that slavery am over, 'cause now the nigger got a chance to live and learn with the whites. They won't never be as good as the whites, but they can live and learn and enjoy in life more. Speaking about the Ku Klux Klan, they ain't do nothing but scare me back in '69. But if we had some now, I thinks that some of these young niggas what has forgot what they mammies told them would do better.
An interview with Clay Bobbitt, 100 years old, of South Harrington Street, Raleigh, North Carolina, May 27th, 1937.
I was born May 2nd, 1837 in Warren County to Washington and Delisha Bobbitt. My master was named Robert Bobbitt, but we always call him Master Dick. Master Dick ain't good to none of us. And on my arm here, just above the elbow, is a big scare this day where he whipped me with a cowhide. He ain't whipped me for nothing but that I's a nigger. I's got a whole heap of them whippings because I ain't obey his orders. And I've seen slaves almost beat to death. I's was married once before the war by the broomstick ceremony, like all of the rest of the slaves. But shucks, they sold away my wife before we'd been married a year. And then the war come on. I had one brother, Henry, who's working for the city, and one sister, Delilah. She's been dead for these many years now. Master Dick owned a powerful big plantation, over 100 slaves, and we worked on short rations and went naked. We ain't gone swimming, nor hunting, nor nothing. We ain't had no pleasures unless we runs away to have them. Even when we sings, we had to turn down a pot at the door to catch the noise. I know some poor white trash. Our overseer was one of them. And them shimshams was also nearby also. We ain't had no use for them, and we sure ain't cared if they had no use for us. The Ku Kluxers ain't done nothing to us, case there ain't many of us in our neighborhood. You see, the Yankees ain't come through here, and we is scared of them. We ain't scared of them anyhow. The white folks and they said the Yankees would kill us if they catches us. I ain't know nothing about no Yankees, nor the surrender. So I stayed on several months after the war was over. Then I comes to Raleigh to work for the city. I worked for the city for near on 50 years. I reckon I just lately retired. I've been sick for about 4 months, and on the second day of May, the day when I was 100 years old, I was able to get to the city lot. I wasn't able to get to the city lot, but I got a lot of presents. This woman is my third wife. I married her 3 years ago.
This is a story or narrative of Hannah Crayson.
My name is Hannah Crayson. I was born on John William Walton's plantation, 4 miles from Ghana and 13 miles from Raleigh, North Carolina, in the county of Wake. I am 84 years old, the second day of March. I belonged to Mr. John William Walton in slavery time. My missus was named Miss Martha. My father was named Frank Walton. My mother was named Flora Walton. Grandma was 104 years when she died. She died at the old plantation. My brothers were named Johnny and Lane. My sisters were Adeline, Violet, Mary, Sarah, Ellen, and Annie. 4 of us are living: Ellen, Mary, Sarah, and me. The old boss was good to us. I was talking about him the other night. He didn't whoop us, and he said he didn't want nobody else to whoop us. It's just like I tell you, he was never cruel to us. One of his sons was cruel to us. We had plenty to eat. We sure did, plenty to eat. We had nice houses to live in. And Grandma had a large room to live in, and we had one to live in. Daddy stayed at home with Mother. They worked their patches by moonlight and worked for the white folks in the daytime. They sold what they made. Master bought it and paid for it. He made a barrel of rice every year, my daddy. Mr. Bell Allen owned slaves too. He had plenty of niggas. His plantation was 5 miles from Arn. We went to church at the white folks' church. When Mr. Bell Allen see us coming, he would say, "Yonder come John Walter's free niggas." Our master would not sell his slaves. He'd give them to his children when they married off, though. I swept yards, churned, fed the chickens. In the evening, I would go with my missus at fishing. We eat collards, peas, cornbread, milk, and rice. We got biscuit and butter twice a week. I thought that best things I ever was butter spread on biscuit. We had cornmeal and flour meal on the plantation. There was 24 slaves on the place. They had brandy made on the plantation, and Master gave all his slaves some of their own uses. My grandmother and mother wove our clothes. They were called homespun. They made shoes on the plantation too. I was not married till after surrender. I did not dress finest in the world, but I had nice clothes. My wedding dress was made of cream silk, made princess with pink and cream bows. I wore a pair of Morocco store-bought shoes. My husband was dressed in a bought suit of clothes. The coat was made of pigeon tail. He had a velvet vest and a white collar and tie. Somebody stole it out of that. One of the master's daughters was cruel. Sometimes she would go out and rail on us, but old master didn't want us whooped. Our great-grandmother was named Flora. They stole her from Africa with a red pocket handkerchief. Old man John William got my great-grandmother that people in New England got scared of we niggas. They were afraid of me would rise against them, and they pushed us down south. Lord, why didn't they just let us stay where we was? Because they never would have been so many half-white niggas, but the old master was to blame for that. We never saw any slaves sold. They carried them off to sell them. The slaves traveled in droves. Father and mother were sold from their children. Children were sold from their parents on the plantation close to us. Where we went to church, we sat in a place from the white folks. The slaves never did run away from master because he was good to them. They run away from other plantations. Yes, we see the patty rollers and we call them poor white trash, and we call patty rollers poor white pets. They had ropes around their necks. They came to our house one night when we were singing and praying. It was just before the surrender. They were hired by the slave owner. My daddy told us to show them brandy our master give us. And then they went on their way. In case they know, John Walton was a funny man about his slaves. They gave us Christmas and other holidays. Then the men would go to see other wives. Some of the men wives belonged to other masters on the plantation. We had corn shucking at night and candy pullings. Sometimes we had quiltings and dancing. One of the slaves, my aunt, she was a royal slave. She would dance all over the place with a tumbler of water on her head without spilling it. She sure could tote herself. I always loved to see her come to church. She sure could tote herself. My oldest sister, Violet, died in slavery time. She was 10 years old when she died. Her uncles were pallbearers. Uncle Hyman and Uncle Handy carried her to the grave. If I makes no mistake, my daddy made her coffin. There was no singing. There were 7 of the family there. That was all. They had no funeral. There was no white folk there. They baptized people in creeks and ponds. We rode corn stalks, bent down small pine trees, and rode them for horses. We also played prison base. Colored and white played, yes, sir, whites and colors. We played at night, but we had a certain time to go to bed. That was 9 o'clock. The boss man looked at us when we were sick. He got doctors. I had the typhoon fever, and all my hair came out, and they called it mitten fever. Dr. Thomas Banks doctored me. He had been dead a long time. Oh, I don't know how long he'd been dead. Never all white folks were, near all the white folks were found dead. Mr. John died. Walton died in bed. Master Joe died sitting under a tree side the path. And Miss Hancy died in bed. I remember the day the war commenced. My master called my father and my two uncles, Handy and Hyman. Our master called them. They had started back to the field to work in the afternoon. He said, "Come here, boys." That was our young master. Ben Walton says, "Come here, boys. I got something to tell you." Uncle Hyman said, "I can't. I got to go to work." He said, "Come here and sit down. I got something to tell you." The niggas went to him and sat down. They told him, "There is a war commenced between the North and the South. If the North whips you, you'll be free as I is, free of a man as I is. If the South whips you, you'll be a slave all your days." Mr. Joe Walton said when he went to war that they could eat breakfast at home, go and whip the North, and be back for dinner. He went away. It was 4 long years before he come back to dinner. The table was so set a long time for him. A lot of white folks said there wouldn't be much of a war, that it couldn't whip them so easy. Many of them never come back to dinner. I was afraid of the Yankees because Mrs. had told us the Yankees were going to kill every nigger in the South. I hung on to Mammy when they come through, though. I thought Abraham Lincoln was the medicine man with the grip in his hand, because he said every born man must be free. I didn't think anything of Jeff Davis. I thank the will of God for setting us free. He got into Abraham Lincoln and the Yankees. We're thankful for the great master that got into Lincoln and the Yankees. Booker T. Washington was fine. I don't know. The white folks did not allow us to have nothing to do with books. You better not be found trying to learn and to read. Our master was harder on that than anything else. You better not be catched with a book. They read the Bible and told us to obey our master, for the Bible said, "Obey your master." This first band of music I ever heard play, the Yankees was playing in it. They were playing a song. I'm tired of seeing the homespun dresses that the Southern women wear. I think Mr. Roosevelt is a fine man, just what we need.
Thank you. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who participated in today's program. The North Carolina slave narratives, as you can see, there are so many stories to be told. Um, our ancestors looked at slavery in so many different ways. Some thought it was good, some of them thought it was horrible. Some of them just, I mean, it just makes you feel or makes you think about everything that they went through. Before I go any further, I believe we have one more voice of freedom.
Tom Holland. I believe they ought to have given us something when we were free, but they turned us out to graze or starve. Most of the white people turned the Negroes slam loose. We stayed a year with Mrs., and then she married, and her husband had his own workers, and they told us to get out. We worked for 20 and 30 cents a day then. And finally, I got a place with Dr. L.J. Conroe. But after the war, the Negro had a hard struggle, because he was turned loose, just like he came into the world, and no education or experience.
We are our ancestors' greatest dream. Remember that. We are our ancestors' greatest dreams. I'd like to thank again everyone for their participation in the program. We have been presenting the Black History Month program for the last 5 years. This year we were able to produce it virtually, and I thank you all for joining the program virtually. If you've not gotten a chance to do so, I encourage you to go online to our Facebook page, Union Memorial Baptist Church of Westminster, or check us out on YouTube to see the programs that have been, the narratives that have been read throughout the month of February, Black History Month. I would also like to thank those who read the narratives throughout this month during our, as far as our online program. That would include, in order of that they were uploaded, Miss Taylor Yancey, who read the narrative of John Beckwith, Reverend Edna Smith, who read the narrative of Lizzie Baker. I was able to read the narrative of Vinnie Baker, Dr. Augustus Harris, who read the narrative of Willie Cozart, Mr. Gregory Jackson brought to us the narrative of Zeb Cowder. Ms. Retha Miles was able to read to us Laura Bell's narrative. Ms. Kim Jones, Danny Kennedy, and Mr. Rodney Morrison presented to us Herndon Borgen. And Ms. LaShawn Thomas gave us Alice Fogg. Today's narratives were read by the following people in this order. Miss Tania Brown, if we could spotlight them. Miss Tania Brown gave us Emma Blaylock. Thank you, Miss Brown. Mr. Linwood Childs gave us Uncle David Blunt. Thank you, sir. Mr. John Woodley gave us Andrew Boone. Ms. Jordan Cosley presented to us Adeline Crump. Thank you, Jordan. Elder Reba Fitchett presented to us Mandy Coverson. Mr. Jeremiah Pearl presented Charlie Berber. Dr. Augustus Harris presented to us Clay Bobbitt. Thank you. And Dr. Tenia Pearl presented to us Hannah Crayson. Thank you. I'd like to do a few special acknowledgments. I'd like to acknowledge Master Matthew Fitchett. Thank you, Matthew. He did an excellent job welcoming everybody to our Black History Month program. I'd also like to acknowledge a few other individuals. Miss Natasha Cosley, Mr. Carl Jackson, Miss Deborah Jackson, Mr. Anthony Nick Barnett, Miss Renee Perkins, Miss Ava Skeets, the NAACP of Westminster, who has always supported the program, the Union Memorial Baptist Church family, and our friends. And I would like to do a special thank you for Dr. Gary Jones and his wife, Miss Janelle Jones, who did the Voices of Freedom for us. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Jones, I'm sorry, with a certificate And the certificate reads as such. Certificate of Appreciation. This is presented to Dr. Gary Jones by Union Memorial Baptist Church of Westminster for his production of the 2021 North Carolina Slave Narratives. So I'd like to thank him, Dr. Jones, for all of your work that you've done in helping to produce not only this online program, but throughout the month, Dr. Jones was able to help create what you all were able to see. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation. I'd like to encourage you to go online once again to look at the narratives that were already produced. The production today will be found on Facebook as well as YouTube. And I would like to welcome you back next year when we present to you additional narratives from North Carolina. Thank you so much for your time and for your efforts. And again, remember, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. Thank you.